Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday everybody. Yesterday was a big video on the COVID surge, so let's look at some other themes in today's episode and return to the subject of COVID and reopening in tomorrow's video. And let's begin today's episode on the diplomatic front, as China's two biggest strategic competitors and trade partners, Japan and the United States, see further domestic pushback against the PRC. This week, the US lawmaker tapped to head a new House Select Committee on China, says that he plans to focus more scrutiny on American money being invested into China, representing a new expansion of the financial aspect of the US-China competition. Quote, "If the story of the last 5-ish years was enhanced scrutiny of Chinese investment in the United States, the next phase of this is going to be the enhanced scrutiny of outbound US investment into communist China." End quote. While there has been talk of such moves for years now, these comments do not sound like empty words anymore. Quote, "Whenever I go to New York and I have this conversation, I feel like there's a tendency to say, well, you're a defense hawk. To the extent we think about a confrontation with China over Taiwan, it's a distant tail risk. I don't think that's the case anymore." End quote. Gallagher has already introduced legislation that would ban the TikTok social media platform in the United States. The so-called House Select Committee on China is a new committee which House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has committed to establishing in 2023 with the purpose to, quote, "coordinate efforts across the government to counter the greatest geopolitical threat of our lifetime." End quote. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, this week, the so-called Conference to Protect Japan's Dignity and National Interests, a conservative group within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, demanded that the Japanese government divulge what it knows about Beijing setting up unofficial Chinese police stations in the country. Accusations of unofficial Chinese police stations at localities around the world have come from the work of a Spanish NGO called Safeguard Defenders, which identified 102 such PRC government facilities in dozens of countries around the globe, including 2 in Japan. According to the organization, China's so-called United Front Work Department oversees the operation of the secret police stations and uses them to monitor overseas Chinese. The NGO disclosed the details of Japanese-based facilities to the Japanese Foreign Ministry, which shared the information with lawmakers, according to Japanese media. Tokyo initially registered an official protest with Beijing, calling the activities an infringement on Japanese sovereignty. However, some Japanese lawmakers believe that this does not go far enough, and there are calls that these facilities be closed immediately. Indeed, Ireland and the Netherlands have already done just that in their respective jurisdictions, with other nations set to follow suit, and yet others, including the UK and Canada, have already opened investigations into the PRC facilities. Beijing denies all these accusations, saying that the facilities are simply designed to provide assistance to its many overseas Chinese citizens. Some Japanese commentators do not accept these explanations, and indeed suspect much fouler play. Quote, "The US has confirmed that it has evidence of electronic listening devices being planted in Americans' cars and other surveillance. So it is quite clear that these are not just to keep an eye on Chinese nationals' activities, but they also act as bases from which to spy on the US and Japan. These officials are not just police, they are engaged in espionage." End quote. So as we can see, Beijing is seeing yet more domestic pushback from within Japan. However, it's not all pessimistic on the diplomatic front. This week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with his Australian counterpart, Penny Wong, in Beijing, the first visit by an Australian foreign minister to China since 2018. At the meeting, the two sides agreed to maintain high-level contact and resume dialogue on a range of areas, including trade and economic issues, representing a further thawing of the relationship that was put on ice in 2020 after Canberra then called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. At the meeting, Wang Yi expressed that the two countries, quote, have no historical grievances, no fundamental conflicts of interest, and should and can be partners in mutual need, End quote. International relations theorists of the realist school of thought would disagree, of course, arguing that Chinese strategists seek to be a hegemon in Asia, pushing external powers like the United States out, pursuing a type of Chinese Monroe Doctrine. The Australians in their foreign policy, since the rise of the Empire of Japan, have sought, through the working with an external power, first the British Empire, of which it had been part of, and later the United States, to prevent the emergence of an Asian hegemon. So a realist would argue that a conflict in fundamental geopolitical objectives does exist between the two powers. However, such a conflict, outside of wartime, does not mean that the two countries cannot cooperate in areas like trade. It does mean, though, that friction will remain in the relationship, friction which will always be exacerbated by cultural and language barriers, deep mutual mistrust, and radically different political systems. For her part, Penny Wong expressed, according to an Australian Foreign Ministry statement, quote, "We can grow our bilateral relationship and uphold our national interests if both countries navigate our differences wisely." End quote. Wong's visit to China followed a meeting between the two countries' leaders last month, which Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng at a press conference this week called, quote, "a guiding light for the bilateral relationship to get out of trouble." End quote. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. Another way to assist the channel as well is to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And for anyone who wants to go that extra mile and help keep China Update sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Okay, next up we need to touch on two important economic updates. According to customs data published this week, Chinese companies imported $2.3 billion of machines used in semiconductor manufacturing in November, down more than 40% from a year earlier to the lowest level since May 2020, smashed by cratering demand and new US export restrictions. Bloomberg reports that imports from 6 major supplying nations, including the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands, all fell at double-digit pace in November, even before some of these nations agreed to join the United States in further limiting shipments of the most advanced gear to China. We remember that the United States is negotiating with the Dutch and Japanese governments currently in order to persuade them to join its unilateral sanctions. Such a three-nation alliance, which, as we've also seen, does appear to be likely, would, quote, represent a near-total blockade of China's ability to buy the equipment necessary to make leading-edge chips, end quote, in the words of one Bloomberg analyst. We remember US sanctions announced in October caused major foreign enterprises to limit or cease the supply to Chinese companies of equipment that make the most advanced chips. Of course, this unfolding technology war is ongoing and we will continue to follow it here on China Update. Next up, and finally for today's video, we need to also briefly talk about our old friend, China Evergrande Group. The debt-laden developer has indicated that it may finally be concluding its dragged-out negotiations with the creditors for its offshore debt restructuring plan, almost half a year later than it had initially promised. The plan would cover only offshore debts though. Evergrande has $20 billion in dollar bonds outstanding, among total liabilities of about $300 billion, though most of this debt is held domestically. In a filing this week, the company expressed, quote, "The differences between parties in the negotiation on the framework and key terms of the restructuring plan are constantly narrowing," end quote. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin, speaking to a dollar bond investor, reports that, quote, "the negotiations with creditors mainly focus on issues such as down payment ratios, debt extension periods, and credit enhancement measures," end quote. We remember that China Evergrande shook markets in December of 2021 when it defaulted on $260 million of dollar bonds, triggering cross defaults. It has also been the face of China's now more than a year-old housing crisis, which continues to pain policymakers, investors, and households alike. At this point, however, Evergrande is but a supporting character, and its fate a subplot in this grand drama for the Chinese economy, as the debt-ridden developer was always just a symptom of China's wider systemic housing crisis, not the cause. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. I will see you all tomorrow.